Thank you, Bill, for that prayer. So I'm here to share with you a little bit of my story about growing in devotion to the Eucharist, this blessed sacrament in which we're about to participate, the source and summit of our Christian faith. So I was not born and raised a Catholic. I was born into a nominal Christian home. We went to church most Sundays, and it gave me a foundation. It gave the seeds of the gospel, and I am eternally grateful for those seeds, because as I strayed, there was something that I had in me to be able to come back to. So I did stray from the time I was about 12 years old to the time I was about 22 years old. There's a good solid decade in there of just living life according to my own terms, not really thinking about or worried with what God had to say in my life, and I lived it with gusto. I was a fraternity guy. I was fully immersed in the ways of the world. And then all of a sudden, about 3/4 of the way through my college career, I just entered into an existential crisis. I was miserable. I was not happy, and I couldn't figure out why. And I spent a lot of long nights and hours trying to figure that out. In myself, of course, because God didn't have a place in my life. So I eventually, along this same timeline, started dating a young lady who was a Catholic. I had never dated a Catholic before. I only knew one Catholic in my whole life before her, right? So we started dating. We fell in love. And then we started having some serious conversations about faith and religion. And somewhere in me, after many, many years of pondering this, somewhere in me, I really did want to change her. At first it's just being the gentleman. Okay, that's fine. Whatever you believe, just don't push that on me. But somewhere in me, I really did want to change her. Not because what she had was bad, but because what she had was too challenging to me, right? To get up on Sunday mornings, to get out of bed, get my head off that pillow, or as Phil said, to get off the couch, right? But thanks be to God for relationships like that and love, because I loved her enough to at least have my comfort zones stretched a little bit. And I did go to Mass. And I did enter into, a period of time where I was listening, and I was trying to let the Lord speak to me about what He had for me. And I remember I had really kind of resisted this Catholic thing, so I was going to go back to the Episcopalian church because that was more comfortable and more right, or whatever it was, right? And I was at this little Episcopalian church on a Sunday evening service, and the minister at one point extended his hands over a piece of bread and said, "Lord, let these become the body and blood of your Son, Jesus Christ." And at that moment, a chill went from the top of my head to the tips of my feet. And I knew in that moment that those words were true. I just didn't know where to find the truth of those words at that moment. And so I started asking a lot of questions, particularly about the Eucharist and about the history of the church. But we're here to focus on the Eucharist, so I'm going to stick with that. So I eventually fought, and I tried to resist, but eventually I found my way to RCIA. And guess what the first session that I attended was on? The Eucharist. And it's taught by your beloved former pastor here from almost 20 years ago, Father Bill Parham, who's a good friend of mine, who is a world-renowned expert on the theology of the Eucharist, right? So I walk in to Father Bill teaching this high theology on the Eucharist, and I said, this is it. I cannot live my life without this anymore. And it was a lightning version of RCIA, just a couple of months, and I was brought into the church. And at the Easter Vigil, that blessed moment where I did receive my first Holy Communion, I walked back to my pew, and there was one word on my lips and in my heart. One word. Home. I had found home. In a lot of ways, because a lot of the other parts of my story, focus on home, but the home where I am fed with the Eucharist. It's the only place where that happens. Home. And so I became Catholic, right? That's the moment I became fully Catholic, when I found that home. And then over the next few years, I started to enter into this Catholic thing. And I was teaching at the University of Memphis at the time, a few days a week, and right next to the University of Memphis is a Catholic parish, St. Anne, on Highland Avenue, and our beloved pastor, Father David, was the pastor there at that point, and they have a perpetual Eucharistic adoration chapel. And so I found myself 3, 4, 5, 6 days a week in front of Jesus in adoration, reading the scriptures, talking to Jesus directly. And it's that period of my life where my faith went from here to here. And that's what it has to do for all of us. It can't remain here. It has to move here. And so Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, in adoration particularly, had a huge impact on my ongoing conversion, that conversion that has to happen in each of us every single day. I became a better husband, and by all means, I am not perfect. I became a better father when the children came along, and I'm still not perfect at that. But now that I'm here at this parish, where we do have the great blessing of a perpetual Eucharistic adoration chapel, I find myself in front of Jesus 2, 3, 4 days a week, just asking him to be my guide, to be my sustenance. Because he's the only one who can provide what we need. And he will provide that sustenance that we need. A couple things I would recommend, as a way of telling you what has helped me. Number one, and I make this number one because I don't want it to be the last thing. I actually have a chapter in my book, the book that Dennis mentioned to you. I don't want to make this a commercial, but there's a whole chapter on the Eucharist. And John mentioned just earlier for us today, Luke chapter 24. It's centered on Luke chapter 24 and that story of the road to Emmaus. So if you would like to pick up a copy of my book, that'd be fantastic. If not, just read Luke 24 and have your own encounter with him. Another would be St. Peter Julian Eimard. St. Peter Julian Eimard is a great devotee of the Eucharist and a great teacher on the Eucharist. You can pick up just about anything that he wrote, and it's going to lead you to deeper devotion to Jesus in the Eucharist. And then finally, St. Alphonsus Liguori. If you know St. Alphonsus or have read anything by him, it's just fantastic. It's always going to deepen us in devotion. He has one in particular. It's called Visits to the Blessed Sacrament. You may have heard, right, there's 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs in the Bible, so you may have heard people recommend reading a chapter of Proverbs each day and just continually doing that. Well, St. Alphonsus wrote a little book to kind of match that method, but it's called Visits to the Blessed Sacrament. And it's 31 days of visits corresponding to each day of the month. So you can go to the Blessed Sacrament any day of the month and have a beautiful devotion by St. Alphonsus. So I would recommend those two things. I mean, we've talked quite a bit about the saints and our friends, the saints, this weekend. So let those saints be your guides to deepen your devotion to the Eucharist. But more than anything else, just enter in. When we celebrate Mass here in just a few moments, just enter in. Don't hold anything back. Make the responses with everything you've got. My wife looks at me sometimes and is like, stop singing that loud. And I'm like, I can't. This is what the Lord draws out of me. I encourage that for you as well. So just enter in. Give yourself fully to this moment where Jesus is going to become present on this altar and give himself fully to you. This is your covenant moment. He gives himself fully to you in the Eucharist. Are you going to give yourself fully back to him? So, that concludes my time. I thank you for your brief attention. But now we are going to turn to the source and summit of our Christian life. Amen.